let's get into it, guys. So we have a bit of an idea of the sort of continuum that I want to help us move along, wherever you're plotting on that continuum, the way that you use color management. My goal here today, as we've titled the session, is to demystify color management a little bit, because it's a solution, it's not a problem, and it's not an add-on or a fun little hack that we can add to our workflows. It's going to change the way that you work for the better. And one of the big things that really clicked for me when I started working with color management is once you understand the core concepts that we are going to emphasize today and work our way through, you'll recognize that it's not nearly as complicated as it sounds. There are I could rattle off 24 terms right now. Color managed, RCM, DaVinci wide gamut, scene referred, display referred, all these different terms in color management that kind of all point at the same 3 or 4 concepts. So if we can get a grasp on those concepts and we can understand, oh, when she says scene referred, that means the same thing as color managing my image. Or when you say RCM, that's the same thing as DaVinci wide gamut. There's so much overlap between these things. So if we can get a better grasp on what all those terms are pointing to, their sort of common headwaters, things are going to be a lot less overwhelming. We're going to have a lot more authority, a lot more ownership of the way that we use color management. So just to give us a little bit of kind of a roadmap for what we're going to be covering in the next hour, I'm going to start by doing some demonstration. I really want to get core concepts in place before we get hands-on. So I'm going to start by working on a random frame that I've pulled that you guys don't have a copy of. So for now, you don't need to follow along. In fact, you won't be able to follow along. And then we're going to get hands-on and look at how this stuff actually applies in Resolve in a couple minutes here. Okay? So we've talked about what color management is, but I want to go a little bit deeper into that as we get started here. So what exactly is color management? A lot of us put up our hand when we said you have some idea of what color management is. Hopefully a lot of you guys listening in on the stream have some idea of what color management is. But I want to give you a simple, concise definition of what color management is. Color management is a framework for transforming what the camera saw into what our display can reproduce. That's it. That's all that color management is. And implicit in that is the fact that most cameras, most professional cameras, even a lot of prosumer cameras, they capture more color volume, more dynamic range than even the best displays can reproduce. So let's go to the very upper end of possibility and say I've got the new Alexa 35 or some great high-end cinema camera, and then let's take the equivalent best in class display that's out there, the most screaming bright HDR display that you can get your hands on, and it's super accurate and has this big wide color gamut and all that stuff. In that scenario, that display is not up to the task of reproducing all the colors that camera saw. Does that make sense? That's something that is changing and shifting, and there may come a day where I can have a camera that captures one thing and a display that can reproduce that image one-to-one. That so far has really never been the case in the course of motion imaging, and it's really not the case today. That is the core value prop, at least one of the core value props of color management, is we have a problem that we are going to have to address ubiquitously. Pretty much any time that we are dealing with motion images, we've got what the camera saw, we've got what the display can show, and they don't tend to agree. And then add into that the variables of well, there's not often just one camera anymore. In my practice as a professional colorist, I honestly can't tell you the last project that I did was oh, there's only one color space. There's only one camera. There's no graphics. There's nothing else. There's only one source color space. There's multiple source color spaces. That's another thing that color management can do for us, is it can help us to find a common destination point for all of those different sources. Okay, so that's our concise definition for color management, and just some other helpful things to understand right off the bat. There are multiple frameworks. I referred to color management as a framework. There are actually multiple frameworks for this. In Resolve, the 2 most common are going to be Resolve Color Management, also known as DaVinci Wide Gamut. That's our first example of overlapping terms. Those things are really used interchangeably. And when I say DaVinci Wide Gamut or you say Resolve Color Management, we are probably talking about fundamentally the same thing. That's sort of variety A or framework A for color management inside of Resolve. The other big one that you're going to hear about a lot is ACES. Okay? If we have time today, I'd actually would love to talk about ACES. We're going to be focused on Resolve Color Management for reasons that I will go into as we go along. If we have time, we'll talk about ACES as well, but these are both different solutions to the same problem. These are both frameworks for performing the task of transforming what the camera saw into what the display can show. Okay? That's our sort of core definitions there. We now know what color management is, right? I want to talk about what color management isn't. for a second, because that's another place where I feel like I got really confused early on in my career, and where many of us tend to. So first of all, color management is not a creative limitation. I've worked with plenty of colorists or other artists in the past who look at what color management does at its foundation, where you might start with a log image, like we're looking at here. And when you see color management applied, as we will in just a moment, we're going to get a normalized image out of the deal, right? It's going to look somewhat reasonable for our display, healthy level of contrast, healthy level of saturation. And there is a constituent that looks at that and goes, well, hey, that's my job. Why are you taking my job? That's what I want to do. That's what I'm here to do. First of all, that's not what we're here to do. And second of all, that is not a creative limitation that's being placed on you. That is a sensible foundation from which your creativity can spring, okay? So color management is not a creative limitation. That's the first thing that color management is not. Color management isn't new. This is another thing that I really like to emphasize when we talk about color management, because there's this sort of upside down notion, at least in my lane, in the color grading world. A lot of the artists that I learned my craft from were from the, what I would call, color correction tradition. They were telecine colorists, and they came from broadcast backgrounds, and they were used to actually having the best case scenario of what we talked about a moment ago. We're like, oh, the source and the display actually kind of agree. Like, I've got this Rec 709, or at the time, like Rec 601 material, like stuff that's already kind of ready for air, and we just need to tweak it and tune it a little bit before it goes live. That's a very different animal than the state of affairs that we are in right now. But those colorists, because they came from that background, they tend to now think of color management when it comes into the story of like, oh, it's this newfangled thing. And maybe it's not trustworthy, or maybe they're still ironing the kinks out, or maybe I'm old school and I like to stick with normal color correction, and I'm not new school, I'm not into this new color management thing. That is a fallacious notion. Color management is not new. If we rewind to what I think of as the cinematic tradition, that I recognize many of us are coming from all kind of different backgrounds, and we may have different visual agendas for our images. Probably most of us, I would venture to say, are not solely in the business of fixing things. We want to make our images look good, right? Not just correct, okay? So to the extent that that is true, if we think about my practice, I'm a colorist. I'm not paid to correct things, I'm paid to make things look awesome, right? So to the extent that that is true, if we look at the cinematic tradition, meaning until the last 20 years or so, shooting on film negative and then reproducing on a film print, that is color management right there. Anyone ever tried to look at a piece of acquired film negative, still or motion? You can't. It's upside down, it's unprocessed, it's undeveloped, it's not suitable for viewing, it was never meant to be viewed, right? In order to view that image in the context it was meant to be seen, you had to print it, right? Same exact type of thing when we're talking about color management. Color management is just a more robust form, or I should say Resolve color management is simply a more robust form of something that has been with us for as long as cinematic imagery has been with us, where you acquire something in a big, raw scene state, and then you sensibly shepherd it out into a reproduction state, okay? So color management is not new. The last thing that color management is not, it is not a workflow hack, it is not a workflow tweak. What I'm going to show you guys today, for those of you who may be newer to color management or who haven't had the opportunity to try it out in your workflows, you're going to be drawn in, at least if you're like me, you're going to be drawn in and go, wow, that's pretty cool. I can now normalize, we're looking at a timeline right now that has literally one shot in it, but when you get into a timeline with 10 or 1,000 or 10,000 shots in it, however many you're grading, you're going to be kind of blown away, at least if you're like me, and go, wow, I can like hit a couple buttons and get a sensible, normalized reproduction without having to touch all those shots. That's kind of amazing. That's a pretty cool hack, or a pretty cool tweak. It's easy to think of it that way. But I just want to be clear, for all of that sort of initial gain that you're going to make with color management, this is not something that you can expect to incorporate into your workflow overnight and have everything else behave and operate in the same way. It's a fundamental change to the way that we master our images and to the way that we think about mastering our images. We're going to go into more depth in that when we start getting into the hands-on portion of our time together today. But that's the last thing that color management is not. It's not an add-on, it's not a tweak, it's not a hack, it's not something that you can exploit alongside your regular good old grading practice. You're going to have to change the way you think about color grading and the way that you color grade a little bit, or color management is really just going to annoy you. And we've probably Many of us had that experience. I know I've met many colorists who have that experience with like, that just annoyed the heck out of me. You know, like, yeah, sure, that's great that it normalized it, but all the controls are weird. All the controls feel weird. We should just expect that. We're going to have to rethink ourselves a little bit when we start incorporating color management into our workflows. Okay? So let's now get hands-on a little bit and talk about the simplest form of color management that I can think of, because I just alluded to one form of color management going all the way back to the cinematic tradition. Okay, I shot film negative and I'm going to shoot, or rather print onto a positive film print, and that's how it's going to be reproduced. So before we get into all of our project settings and how do I flip that and how do I set that and what about this color space and what if I shot on this camera or what if I'm mastering for HDR and all these variables that we get into when we're talking about color management, let's for a moment look at the simplest possible form of color management that we could use in a project. I'm going to go onto this shot here, and as I've emphasized already, this is a log state image. Okay, this image is not currently being reproduced in any form that it was ever meant to be reproduced in. This low contrast, this low saturation, this was not meant to be a foundation or a starting point. This reproduction that we are seeing right here has to do with the fact that my display cannot show everything that this camera saw. Make sense? So we need to do something about that. And that's what color management is. And I want to start by looking at the simplest possible form of color management I can think of, and that would be a LUT. And in this case, I'm going to use the manufacturer's provided LUT and apply it to my image here. That's the Arri Alexa Log C to Rec 709 LUT. That is in your LUTs folder. Again, you don't happen to be working with this particular piece of Alexa material, but it will work for the sake of our example here. So I'm going to apply that. And there we go. That's textbook color management. It is now normalized, right? Now, to be clear, it's not color graded. This is not a particularly artful reproduction. My job literally hasn't begun as the colorist, but it is in a sensible starting point. And this is a very different approach to what I was taught when I began color grading, where they'd say, okay, Cullen, well, here's what you do when you have a log state image. Back in those days, it was usually film negative. And they'd say, well, what you got to do is go over here into your primaries and drop your lift and stretch out your gain and add some saturation because it's going to be really low saturation, and just keep slamming those knobs until you start to get a reasonable reproduction. This is the alternative. This is the superior alternative to this, okay? So all we are going to do from here with our world's simplest color management here is do all my grading off to the left. That's it. I could totally master an entire Arri Alexa timeline like this, and I would indeed be using a form of color management. And this is the simplest possible form that I can think of. So one of my core principles, not only as a colorist, but as a color scientist that I always try to come back to is, what is the simplest possible solution, right? That should be what we are aimed at. We don't want to seek complexity. Complexity will find us in color grading. We want to seek simplicity. So when I see something like this, my immediate question is, all right, so what else do we need? Are we done? Did I end 45 minutes early? Cool, we're done. We can all go grab a coffee, right? Let's talk about some of the limitations that come into play here. First of all, what if I didn't shoot on an Alexa? My LUT is dumb. And we're going to do a quick detour and talk about LUTs for a minute because we're going to return to LUTs later on. This LUT is dumb. This LUT doesn't know what I'm feeding it. It's just a bunch of numbers, right? So my input, what I'm providing to this LUT, has to align with the design intent of this LUT. This LUT was designed to take Arri Alexa Log C and return Rec 709. And this is a core principle we're going to need to return to later on. All LUTs are this way. All LUTs expect one thing and will return one thing. And if you don't like what it's giving back, or you don't feed it what it expects, you will not be happy with your LUT. Sooner or later, you're going to get into trouble. So in the case of my world's simplest color management, I'm in great shape if there was only ever one camera on the planet, right? Otherwise, I'm going to have a LUT for every single one of those cameras, and it starts to get a little bit cumbersome. So we're going to make a little tweak. We're going to click up the complexity ladder just a little bit in the interest of getting a little bit more flexibility, okay? So here would be an alternative to this reproduction. And what I want to do actually is grab still. And I'm now going to wipe out node number 2 here. And let's reset whatever errant keystroke I've done here. And I'm going to use a color space transform. Have you guys ever messed around with the color space transform before? Let me know. Yeah, they're a big ingredient that we're going to be working with today. So in this case, I get to designate my source and my destination. So it's a lot more dynamic than a typical LUT like we were just looking at here. So I'm just going to explicitly designate, well, I'm coming from area wide gamut 3, area log C3. I'm still getting used to that 3 suffix on there, which was added because we now have the new Alexa 35 with its log C4, which is very exciting. So we're going to go Rec 709 gamma 24, and we now have an alternative to what we just did here. Now, there's something else that is going to come up alongside this little experiment that we're doing. So before we talk about all the benefit that we've netted here, I just want to point something out to you. If I wipe between these two, there we go. Cool. So if I wipe between these two, it's actually a different reproduction, right? Didn't I just get done saying that this is not color grading, this is not creative, this is not subjective, this is technical? Shouldn't these align perfectly? If that LUT was designed to take me from area Alexa log C out to Rec 709, and that's what this color space transform is designed to do, shouldn't those agree like 1 to 1?
Yeah.
They yeah, wait a minute. But they don't, do they? And in this case, it's a fairly innocuous discrepancy, but you'll see, you know, again, if we have time to explore ACES for a moment toward the end of our time together today, these discrepancies between the way different color management solutions get us out to that final Rec 709 image, they can actually be quite different. They can be quite distinct. So it's kind of important to understand why that is. Any of you guys who've hung out with me before have already heard me use my favorite analogy. Saying, okay, color space transform, I would like you to take my area wide gamut 3, area log C3 image and transform it out to Rec 709 gamma 24. This is roughly the equivalent of us walking outside and finding the nearest construction site and me saying, hey, you see that 100 tons of dirt there? I would like you to take that 100 tons and put it into the, what do you call the thing on the front of a bulldozer? I don't spend that much time doing construction. The bucket, there we go. So if I'm going to tell you, I'd like you to take that 100 tons of dirt and place it into this 10-ton bucket or 20-ton bucket. Like, well, how am I going to do that? There's not enough room for all of the dirt, right? Similar thing here, because remember what we started this conversation with, the camera sees something different than the display can show, and in most cases, not all cases, most cases, the camera sees more than the display can show. So the reason we are seeing a discrepancy here is because the color scientists and the engineers who engineered this color space transform functionality versus the area Alexa log C to Rec 709 LUT arrived at different equally valid solutions for solving that problem. So there is some subjectivity cooked in there. It's just subjectivity that we as artists, as end users, are really not equipped to navigate. We want to take advantage of the sound color science that the engineers in both of these examples are using. But I just want to point out there is a difference in reproduction, and this becomes a bigger theme. Once you start to get up on color management a little bit more, that's going to be something that I'll sort of encourage you to consider when you're saying, oh, well, should I use ACES or should I use Resolve Color Management? Should I make my own color management and get really geeky like Cullen does? One of the big questions that is going to accompany your answer, or one of the big considerations that's going to accompany your answer, is which reproduction do you prefer? Okay, because they are going to be different. All right, now that we've done a little detour through the variation in reproduction that we're seeing here, we've now got a superior solution to what we had a moment ago with our Rec 709 area Alexa log C to Rec 709 LUT, because remember my question that I asked before of like, well, that's great, but what if I have a different source? Well, now I have a mechanism for dealing with that. So we're going to be looking at some black magic footage here in just a moment. When we do, I could simply navigate to the proper color space and gamma, and my color space transform is now going to be correct for that material, right? So we've added a little bit of complexity, but we've got a little bit of flexibility to accompany that change, okay? Now we have a new problem though. We can modify our color space transform quite easily so that whatever footage we are working on will align easily with, you know, if we have 3 different cameras, we can do a color space transform tailored to each of those cameras. Now we have a new problem. Remember I talked earlier about how your controls and the behavior of your color corrector are going to feel different when you're working in a color managed workflow as opposed to in a what we could call a display referred workflow. A minute ago when I started turning knobs and just kind of trying to slam it into a reasonable reproduction, that's another fun term that we can, you know, log in our notes. That's a display referred workflow. The easiest way to remember that is that display referred workflows literally refer to the display. for all of your decisions. Scene referred workflows, which is just another term for color management, refer to the scene for information about how it ought to be reproduced. Okay? So in the context of this display referred workflow, when we are working in that way, in the context of our scene referred workflow, we have another challenge. So our controls are going to behave really different. Really simple example, if I want to think in a more photographic manner, which is one of my big tenets as a colorist, it's something that it's a language that I try to speak with my clients. It's one of the big things that I emphasize in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments. I encourage you to think photographically. So that would be about, easy example, thinking more in exposure than in gamma, right? I was taught to think in, well, you need to drop your midtones a little bit. A much more photographic way to think about that would be to say, well, let's trim exposure by 1/3 of a stop. That's a language that's more meaningful to the production counterparts that we work with. That's the native language of the image until it hits our doorstep as colorists. So it's a better way to think about the image, to manipulate it on its terms, as opposed to transforming it into this whole other realm of, gamma and lift and gain, etc. So if we're thinking about thinking photographically, the first thing that I do when I'm thinking photographically about my images is I think about the core consideration of photography, exposure. Okay? Now, if I want to get a reasonable analog for exposure when I'm in a color managed environment, even in a really simple one like this, I can go to my offset here. And if I drop this offset, let's actually get our scopes in play as well, so you can sort of see the story on the scopes. And I'm just going to set this up in the manner that I like to. I like to use a histogram and a vector scope. One shows me my tones and my densities, one shows me my colors. So let's go over here to my offset and just start to drop things down, okay? You can see in the image, I'm getting an exposure-like response, right? And my shadows are indeed reaching the floor and compressing toward the floor, but this is very different. If you've ever tried using offset in a display referred context, i.e. downstream or to the right of this transformation out to Rec 709 after the image is already in a Rec 709 state, if I go to offset here, I'm gonna get very different behavior. As soon as I start dropping down, I'm going to start slamming like hard into the floor. Now, we're all looking at this image in a relatively small window. I'll try to remedy that a little bit. And we're all looking at this image either on a screen if you're watching the stream, or we're looking at a projector here in the room together. This may not be as blatantly obvious as it is when you're looking at a calibrated reference monitor, but trust me, this is not fun. Working offset in a scene state or a scene space is very fun. It's very exposure-like. So this is a bit of a detour, but an important one, because I wanted to put a little bit more meat on the bone talking about how it is that working in a color managed context differs from working in a a display referred context, okay? So that's just one of many examples, and we're gonna look at a few more of those as we go along here. But there's another sort of like subtler wrinkle to this. In the same way that working color managed is going to get you a different feel, a different response, a different behavior out of your tools than when you are working display referred, that's actually true in different scene color spaces as well. So right now, my working color space, which is a term we're going to return to shortly, my working color space, because this material was shot in ARRI wide gamut 3, ARRI log C3, and I've yet to do anything to it here in node number 1, right? I'm just taking the original camera negative and starting to mess around with it, and the transform out to my display is happening later, right? So my working color space is ARRI wide gamut 3, ARRI log C3. Makes sense? When I'm in ARRI wide gamut 3, ARRI log C3, the behavior of my tools will differ from when I'm in, say, Blackmagic Film Gen 5. It won't be as dramatic of a difference as when I'm going from Rec 709 back out to a camera log state, but it will be different. So that's the first problem that we have here if we decide that our solution is sufficient and we're simply going to color space transform from whatever our source is out to our display and do all of our grading off to the left of that point. Our controls are going to have a different response. And to go away from the sort of technical side of what we're talking about this morning, where you're going to find when you get up on color management is like feel becomes really, really important. Like I don't think about most of the stuff that we are talking about this morning. This is just backdrop. This is just context that I have in my color grading practice. But when I'm actually color grading, I rely on my eyes, I rely on my hands, I rely on feel. I rely on knowing roughly what that offset wheel is going to do before I even touch it, right? That's going to vary color space to color space. That's not so great. Here's the other thing. We talked about LUTs a minute ago, right? We talked about how LUTs always expect one input color space and one output color space. If you have a LUT that you love to work with, we're sort of back to the same old chestnut if you want to use what I would call a look LUT or a creative LUT, meaning it operates in your scene space. You can't have a look LUT that will work for all your different cameras. A look LUT will only work, as any LUT will, for one color space at a time, right? So that is the reason we need to take another click up this complexity ladder, all right? So we're slowly increasing complexity, but for good reason. I'm going to start labeling as we go along here because we're starting to get a little more complicated. Let's label this node. I'm going to call this 2709, like so. That's my transform to 709. But what I want to do is introduce a third color space. Right now we have two color spaces in play, right? What's the camera's color space? What's the output color space? That's it. And by the way, another couple of terms that we can sort of add to our growing appendix or index or dictionary of color management terms. Output color space, ODT, output transform. Those all kind of refer to the same thing. What are you going to? What are you mastering this on? Are you on a Rec 709-ish display? Are you on some kind of fancy HDR display? It's the same thing all those terms are pointing at. It's like, where are you bound? Where are you destined? Okay? So we have our output color space. We have our camera color space, right? We got to know what the camera saw so that we can perform that job of transforming it into what the display can show, right? That's two spaces. I want to introduce a third now. We're going to introduce a working or an intermediate, or what Resolve sometimes rather confusingly calls a timeline color space. Those are three terms for the same darn thing, okay? And I will explain, we're going to see why this is important in just a moment, but for now, just trust me. For our input color space, we're going to say DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate. Let's go ahead and reset this here. So I've got the beginnings of a slightly more complex, but again, slightly more flexible, slightly more dynamic, slightly more effective form of color management. So I need one other link in the chain, because if we sort of like follow the thread of color space transformation, what is the only color space transformation happening right now? We're going from DaVinci wide gamut intermediate out to Rec 709 gamma 2.4. Okay, great. That's a good start. However, is what I'm telling Resolve to do, am I telling it to do the right thing currently? I'm telling Resolve, hey, I'm feeding you a DaVinci wide gamut intermediate input, but I'm lying. That's not true, is it? I'm feeding it area Alexa log C3. So I need another transform. Time for another stack of terms that all mean the same darn thing, okay? You ready? Input transform, IDT, source color space, same thing. All we need to designate now is an input color space or an input transform or an IDT for anyone who's messed around with ACES before, which stands for input device transform, I believe. All the same darn thing. I don't really care what the acronym stands for because it all says the same thing to me. It's the concept more than the explicit particulars of whatever the term is. So I hope that as I've been rambling just now, some of you guys have started guessing and go, oh, I already know what this guy's going to do. I'm already way ahead of him. I hope that that happens throughout our session today, that you run out in front of me and you're beating me to the punch. See what I'm doing here? Area wide gamut 3, area log C3, to DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. And before we talk about the particulars of what we are going to do with this slightly more complex node graph, we can just look and see that we have ended up with an identical reproduction to what we had a moment ago. And in fact, I would like to prove that to myself and to us. So here's exactly where we were before. Area wide gamut 3, area log C3, out to Rec 709 gamma 2.4. I've turned off this other node. We're back to our warm and fuzzy, cozy, simple one transform color management solution, okay? Let's delete this other still that we grabbed. Let's grab a still of this. And then let's go back to what I just did. DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate. We're gonna go over here and turn this back on. And let's compare one to the other. They're identical. It's the same exact thing, right? We're adding one more link to the chain, one more step to the journey. And as we said before, that is adding complexity. Complexity is not desirable, but complexity is necessary sometimes. And in this case, I want to look at what this complexity is netting us. Before I do, I'm going to go ahead and label this node, and we're going to just say to DaVinci wide gamut. Now again, to reemphasize, my working color space is now no longer Arial Alexa log C3, it is DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. This right here, this is the very first thing I'm going to do to every single image in my timeline. If I'm not working with area material, I will simply change my input parameters here, but everything before I do a darn thing to it shall be transformed into DaVinci wide gamut intermediate so that I have a common working space. Sort of like having everything mapped into the same realm, onto the same playground. So now things like my LUTs, I can use one look LUT. If I love that look LUT, I can use it regardless of what I captured, right? The feel that I talked about cultivating with your controls, how does offset respond? How does contrast, pivot, saturation, whatever your go-to tools are, how do those respond? You're gonna now have the opportunity to cultivate a relationship with those tools because their response is going to be consistent regardless of whatever camera you shot, okay? So, let's flip over to our timeline. Let's start looking at this in a practical context. We're going to flip over to the material that you guys have if you've downloaded it ahead of time. And just to point out something before we move off of this, what I've just shown you is one of the two ways of setting up color management inside of Resolve. This is what we would call a node-based color management solution or color management pipeline. Tons of colorists like to work in this exact fashion that I'm showing you here. This is actually how I perform my color management. But what we are going to do next is probably the more common, the more vanilla, the more quote unquote normal form of color management that many of us have probably already played around with, where we go into our project settings and we start playing around with all those scary parameters that are revealed to us. But when we do that, all we are doing is applying this framework in a different form, okay? So this is another term that we can add to our list. A color space transform is a unit of transformation within Resolve Color Management or DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, okay? And that's distinct from, for example, an ACES transform, which is a unit of transformation within an ACES framework, okay? So all we've done here is set up a color management framework, a DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate framework or a Resolve Color Management framework, whatever you want to call it. All we've done is set that up in nodes as opposed to in our project settings, which is what we're going to do next as a group. But it's helpful for me, at least when you're starting. You may ultimately decide you want to do things in project settings. I love starting with color management, learning about color management in the way that we just did, because you can see it visually. You can see the flow. And just a great tip that I will give you guys as you go away from our time together today and start playing around with color management or exploring it, you're gonna get stumped. There's gonna be instances where you're like, that doesn't look great. What is going on? What am I doing wrong? What step am I missing? What drop-down menu am I selecting the wrong parameter within in my project settings? The best thing you can do is either go back to doing things explicitly in nodes, or at least in your mind's eye, visualize that flow. Visualize that journey from here out to there. If you can visualize that, you're gonna have a lot easier time of getting the right components in place and troubleshooting when you run into problems. All right, let's go to this other timeline. So, we're back to our same old challenge that we had a little while ago, right? We have a timeline of well-shot material that happens to be in camera log, right? We need to transform what the camera saw into what the display can show. We're gonna do exactly what we just did a moment ago, up to and including having a total of 3 color spaces in play. We are gonna have an input color space, a working color space, and an output or a destination color space. Now we're gonna set it up in our project settings. So I'm gonna go to my little gear icon down here in the lower right, and we're gonna go up to our color management. And since it's our first time looking at this section of our project settings, I want to talk about this a little bit. This is another area where things get confusing for many of us. So right now my color science is set to DaVinci YRGB, which is not a terribly meaningful phrase to me or to probably most of us in this room. And even more confusingly, I've got drop-down menus for color spaces like we were just looking at, right? So what this says to me, if you were to drop me cold into Resolve right now, it's like, oh cool, so is this like where I do my color management? Cool. Do I do Area Log C3, or actually in this case, we're gonna do the proper transform for this material, which among the many, many Blackmagic design color spaces is gonna be Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5, okay? And then output color space for X709 Gamma 2.4. Like, is this my color management? Does that work? Just run this, we're running this test right now. Prove this out to yourself as many times as you need to. Look at the image here. Like, I'm moving this window so you can see the image and see how it changes when I hit save. It doesn't change at all. We didn't do anything, right? What the heck? What's the deal with these tags? We can return back to this and talk about this. This is actually a very useful set of drop-down menus if you're working in nodes, like I was just talking about. That is where you would use this, but this is not used for color management. This is used for tagging and other operations within the Resolve ecosystem that we can return to a bit later on. So the TLDR, the shorthand here for this color science dropdown, DaVinci YRGB, what does that mean? That means Resolve, do not help me. I got this. I will do everything that I need to take my image from wherever it began to wherever it's going. Hands off, do not help me whatsoever, regardless of the fact that there are these slightly confusing drop-down menus immediately below it. DaVinci YRGB will not help you. It will not color manage for you. You are on your own. That's not what we want right now. We want to use DaVinci YRGB color managed. That's a bit more meaningful than DaVinci YRGB. When you see those two side by side, you're like, oh, okay, so this is where my color management will happen. And now we're presented with another sort of challenge of the way that color management is implemented in Resolve. They've done a really good job in Resolve of trying to make color management simple, because we've been talking for, 30 minutes now. And there's some contour to this conversation, right? There's a bit of complexity, there's some moving parts, and I probably could have talked a little bit faster, but in general, it kind of takes a minute to get through this stuff, right? So what they've tried to do in Resolve is to make this conversation a little bit simpler, to make it easier for us to begin to work in color management if we haven't all chosen to give Cullen an hour of our time to talk about the topic, right? The problem is that it is obscuring the very concepts that we need to understand if we ever hope to become fluent and functional with color management. So the first thing I'm going to do here is turn off automatic color management. We want to do manual color management. We want to be in control. We want to know all the pieces of the puzzle. So I'm going to turn that off. And then for my color processing mode, I'm once again going to elect and say, you know what? I appreciate you trying to give me the automatic shifter. I want the stick shifter. I want manual control. I need to understand what's going on under the hood. This is a little bit more intimidating, but I promise this is the only way to get fluent in color management. Your best case scenario that you can hope for if you're using automatic color management and the stock color processing mode, your best case scenario is that you'll get a decent result once, maybe 5 times, maybe 10 times. Sooner or later, you're going to get a problematic result, and you will have no idea what to do about that because you have no idea what's going on under the hood. So we don't all need to become color scientists this morning, but we do need to understand the building blocks of color management and how those are implemented inside of Resolve if we hope to be able to consistently get good results and troubleshoot things and not end up in a scenario that, again, I've heard far too many sort of color management doubters bring up where they say, Cullen, I was in the room with clients and it looked insane and I couldn't fix it. Color management is not trustworthy. Color management is too confusing. It's like, well, no, it's not confusing. You haven't given yourself the opportunity to learn it, right? So we're going to emphasize understanding the pieces so that we can navigate this effectively in a variety of circumstances, not just the particular circumstance we're looking at today. So we got a bunch of menus, a bunch of options that just popped up when I went to this color processing mode of custom. And most of these, the important ones, I think most of us in this room, most of us on the stream, if you've been paying attention and not tabbing over to your Instagram and listening to me, we could probably fill in the important ones of these by this point, right? So I hope you will try to beat me to the punch on these things. Input color space. In this case, we're going to do a little bit of a plot twist because we're now working with some different material. Input color space is going to be Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5 because that is the color space of this material. Timeline color space. This is a little confusing, as I said before, because timeline color space can be confusing, but remember what we said. Timeline color space, working color space, intermediate color space, all the same thing. This is just what do you want to work in? We know that one too, right? DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. output color space, Rec 709 Gamma 24. These three things, input, timeline, and output, these are the things that matter. If you get these things right, these other settings matter. They will change the reproduction of your image, but you can play around with them. You can look into which ones work better or worse for you. You're not going to have like mission critical problems because you set your input DRT to the wrong thing. So focus on these things within this custom framework. And as we have time and as you guys have questions, I'm happy to go into more detail on what these other things mean. But if you just get those three things right, where are you coming from? What do you want to work in between? And where are you going? You're good to go. Okay? And let's watch the magic trick that I never get tired of seeing, of looking at the image in its log state and hitting save and seeing that we now have a normalized image. We have a good place to start from, okay? So this is a great example of color management in practice, and it really can be as simple as that, as knowing your input, knowing your working space, and knowing your output space, okay? So now that we're here, let's talk about what we actually do from this point. Okay, so we've got some color management set up. Hopefully we've all got a bit more of a grasp on not only how to color manage Cullen's timeline that happens to have Blackmagic Film Gen 5 material in it, but how to color manage, period, right? Now that we're here, what happens? Because as we talked about before, I have not done any color grading whatsoever. This is a precursor. This is a foundation to my color grade. How do I actually go about color grading now? How does that differ from the way I might used to be, or I might be accustomed to color grading, I should say, if I've been working in a more display-referred context, okay? So let's talk about a couple principles. The first one is that offset, as we've already alluded to, offset's your friend. Offset's really good when you're color managed. Offset is your exposure. And I'm just gonna go ahead and build out the core of the node tree that I use in every project that I tackle. And I like to label nodes because it helps me keep things clear. And when I was a kid, I loved my Matchbox cars, but I didn't like to play with the Matchbox cars. I like to line up all the Matchbox cars perfectly, get them all right in a little line there. So this is my grown-up version of lining up my Matchbox cars, and I'm lucky enough to have found a healthy outlet for that, okay? So we have our exposure, we have our ratio, and we have our balance. If you set up good color management and you do nothing else but populate these nodes with sensible adjustments, you are at a threshold that is critical to me. This is something that I share with my clients all the time. 80% of what it's ever going to look like, 80% of like the best your image is ever going to get and where we're going to get after all our fussing and finessing and tuning and tweaking and notes and feedback, 80% of that is going to happen in the first 20% of our color grade. That's the promise of color management. That's one of the good things about working in this way. The foundation's already there, and now you're just filling things in, and you're filling in photographic parameters. So that's really what we're going to do from here, is think about exposure using offset. Okay? That is all I'm going to do in node number one. I'm only going to work exposure, and I'm only going to use my offset wheel for that operation. Let's turn this gallery off so we can see this image a little bit bigger. Let's even go crazy and do that. So that's what I'm going to do here. And I'm just starting to kind of preferentially grade. Let's look at a tighter frame here. And actually turn these clips back on. And I'm going to paste this tree that I'd started working with over in shot number one. Now, I actually want to check something, and this is a good detour for us to go on quite quickly. A question comes up when we're setting up our color management here, back over here in our project settings. Well, what if we have more than one input color space? Am I tethered to just what I elect here and that's all that there can ever be when I'm setting things up in this way? No, you can set things up on, an individual basis. And in some cases, you actually need to do this just to get the correct input. So I'm going to right click on this image and I'm going to look at input color space here, okay? So this input color space allows me to flip from the stock or the preset, what's tagged up here as the project setting. Do this like so. Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5, I should say. That's kind of a mouthful. We can flip that to whatever we want here. If I happen to have, oh, this is some Astro Design A-log material. I've actually not ever run into Astro Design A-log, but I'm really looking forward to that day. In the meanwhile, you can see here, for whatever reason, this has already been sort of manually overridden and tagged in this way. So I'm going to go up here and say, no, really, use the project setting. That's better, okay? So that's kind of a tangent, but a good opportunity to look at how we would flip our input color space if indeed we needed to. And I'll also show us while we're in that same breath, If you want to show yourself, or if you want to show your client, hey, where are we coming from? You can right click on your same image and say bypass color management. And now we're looking back at the original camera log state, okay? But going back to the task at hand of starting to grade some pretty pictures, this is the fun thing about color management to me, is it is a sensible, sound, scientifically derived framework within which you can just play jazz, you can just surf. Make the image look good. That's literally all that matters. One of the big differences between working color managed versus like display referred is like your scopes, you're gonna find your scopes play a very different role in your workflow. If you're used to your scopes being your co-pilot, your scopes will no longer be your co-pilot, at least they shouldn't be. Your scopes are literally your flight instruments. You are your pilot and your co-pilot. We don't have co-pilots as colorists. You are the person flying the airplane. You have passengers who have a destination in mind, i.e. your clients, so if you take them to the other side of the world when they're expecting to get to Newark, New Jersey, you're gonna have problems, but you are the pilot, okay? Your scopes are your instruments. They are not there to help you arbitrate what you do. So your scopes can help you out of trouble or help you identify problems, but you don't need to make your scopes look a certain way when you're color managing. This is not what I was taught when I began color grading many years ago. I was taught all these rules that are like, it's not enough to make the image look like you want it to look. If the scopes do this or that, or they don't do that, you have a problem and you must make the scopes do that. That's done. You can forget about that the moment you start to work color managed. It's one of my favorite benefits of it, okay? So I'm literally just going in and manipulating my image in a photographic way, like we talked about, to make it look like I want to make it look good, to make it look like my client wants to. So I'm gonna drop exposure. Over here in my ratio, I'm gonna use either lift and gain in combination or contrast and pivot in combination. Dealer's choice. Pick one that feels good to you. Pick one that feels most natural, most organic. In this case, I'm just gonna try kind of clicking up that contrast and pivot, like so. So a little more contrast and then pivot a little bit more like so. And that's gonna be my ratio node, and I could back that off at any time. And now I've got my balance. This is where I'm gonna perform my RGB color balancing and just look at the image and say, okay, ratio of red to green to blue, am I happy with that? Do I wanna do something about that? And here again, this is balance that is separate and distinct from the type of balance that I was taught when I began color grading, white balancing, black balancing, like corrective balancing. My assumption when I'm operating within a color managed framework is that if the image was shot according to its light source, meaning that this camera was expecting the light source that was illuminating the scene, I expect to need to do zero balancing whatsoever. The balance, once again, is just about what are we into? What do you want to see? It's not about fixing things. It's not about like trying to correct or repair or discipline the material. It's just about looking at the image and going like, oh, do we want to go like a little warmer maybe? Would that be nice? Get a little more color separation in there maybe? That's kind of cool. I'm into that. And I'm done. So that 80% marker that I just referred to, 80% of what it's ever going to look like, it's going to look like in the first 20%, we're there. If this is a real project and I'm working on it with a client, we're going to go through like 3 rounds of feedback and revisions, and we're going to window stuff and qualify stuff and do all kinds of details that I love doing. It's super fun to do in color grading, and we could have a whole session talking about those fine details and the nuance and the value adds they make to our story. But for the end viewer, the person watching this at the end of the day, that first 80%, like their net visual experience, is going to come from the things that we've already done just by going this far, okay? So that's just a soft intro to the way that I conceptually think about grading inside of a color managed context, and also to the difference in the behavior of the tools. I want you to notice that in these 3 nodes that I'm using to get a net of this, which is like, okay, we're starting to get somewhere. We got some mood, we got a vibe going on here. This is literally 3 knobs. This is offset, contrast, and pivot, okay? So that's, if you take nothing else away from like, oh, what tools should I use, or what tools are gonna be the most useful in a color managed workflow, start with that offset. It's the simplest, broadest possible tool that you can use when you're color grading, and you can get great results out of it when you are in a scene or a camera log state and operating in that manner, okay? So that's kind of a 101 on grading within a color managed environment, and on keeping it simple, some of the things we need to be more aware of when we are color managing, and some of the things that we can very happily let go of and forget about when we're working in color management, okay? All right, so next thing I want to talk about, I want to return to LUTs for just a minute here, okay? So I made the other sort of claim that one of the benefits of having our intermediate working space, which, by the way, just to clarify, what is our working space right now? What's our intermediate space? We're in DaVinci wide gamut intermediate, right? One of the benefits of that is that it doesn't matter that this material happens to be Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5 and the material in the other timeline that we were just looking at happens to be Arri Alexa. It doesn't matter. I can use, as long as I have a LUT that is set up for my particular working color space, such as my elements LUTs that I'm going to look at here, or even better, let's look at my Kodak 2383 LUT, which is a free download. I'll get you guys a link for it if you want to download it. This is my look LUT. This is the sort of like, if we think about making that transition from like, okay, we've got our image, we're in camera log state, we got to do something about that. Now we know something better we can do about that than simply twisting knobs until it looks decent. We're going to color manage that, right? And then we want to start to work on actually grading by hand and making creative manipulation, preferential manipulation of the image. Something that sort of rests in between, okay, we're color managing the timeline and now I'm grading individual shots, would be establishing a look. A look is, just for a quick definition, it is a preferential manipulation of your image that does not change from shot to shot. So it's going to be the same on shot 1 as shot 100. That's the whole point of it. If anybody's a big Lebowski fan, looks really tie the room together. Really brings everything into one common space, okay? So in this case, let's use this 2383, and this is actually a great example because if I drop this on, I may not love what I'm seeing. It's looking a little crunchy, a little dense, a little bit under to me, and that's because I just started doing grading without my look, without my LUT in place, which is really not the way I would do things. You want to get that look in place early so that you have it for your context for making all your other grading decisions. So, easy example here, I would make these, in particular, my exposure and my ratio decisions. I'm going to make those differently under this LUT than without this LUT. It's adding a big old hit of contrast because, by the way, that's what a film print does. Okay, so that we're kind of coming back full circle to our film print conversation that we started our session with here today. But when you're working underneath a LUT, and it is a LUT that is properly set up as this one is, you can see it right here, DaVinci wide gamut to DaVinci wide gamut. That means I expect DaVinci wide gamut, I will give you back DaVinci wide gamut. When you have look LUTs like these, when you have a library of them like I've developed for myself and like I have available to you here in this free 2383 LUT, as well as with my elements LUTs here that you can mix and match. They all expect DaVinci wide gamut. They will all return DaVinci wide gamut. This is, to me, one of the other core value props of having this intermediate or this working color space that added a little bit of complexity to our workflow, but once we understand it and once we have it in place, we can use these LUTs on whatever project we want, and it doesn't matter what it was originally shot on. It's a way of sort of setting aside the technical and the creative portions, or distinguishing the technical and the creative portions of color grading. We're like, all right, we got to get the technical in place so that once it's in place, we're done. And we can just focus on creative preferential reproduction. So that's an example of the benefit of having this working color space and then being able to use LUTs designed explicitly for a working color space, as opposed to designing a LUT like I could have done for some particular camera space that then only those of us who shot on that camera and are using it for this project would be able to take advantage of. Since I built these for DaVinci wide gamut, you can use them and I can use them on any project I want as long as I'm properly color managing. Okay? All right, so we're going to have a time for a couple questions from you guys, but before we do, I want to cover a couple of like really common questions, the questions that come up when I'm talking about color management, the questions that came up for me when I first started learning color management. Here's the first one, probably the biggest one. What if I don't know my color space of the camera that I shot on, right? What do I do then? Well, the truth is you need to. That is one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest sort of burdens that comes with color management. You need to know what your material was acquired on. I can tell you as a professional, a lot of the time that's easy. You know, if the cinematographer is in the conversation, they know what camera they shot on, and depending on that camera, there may be just one color space that's possible, such as with an Alexa, or in the case of like a Blackmagic camera like we're working with here today, there's actually a number of color spaces that they could have chosen to shoot on. We have to figure out which one of those you did shoot on. And it's a real question. It's a good question to ask. Like, oh, well, what if I don't know? Well, the truth is you got to find out. I can't really sugarcoat it for you. You got to find out. And again, I can tell you in my professional practice, it's a matter of diligence. And because I've seen the benefit long-term, job after job after job, of working in a color managed context, I'll very patiently ask. I'll say, whoever, the post coordinator probably doesn't know what color space. If I circle back and say, hey, question for you guys, do you know what color spaces you shot on? Often the post coordinator is going to go, no, I don't, I'm sorry. I'll say, okay, no big deal. Any chance we could find out? Telling me nobody knows what color space we shot on? There wasn't a first AC who had to pick a color space? Someone knows, right? And as long as we're not jerks about it, and as long as you don't give people the pressure of time of saying, I need to know in the next hour, then we can usually find that answer. And if you're shooting for yourself, as I know many of us may be, it's time for you to start paying more attention to the color space that you acquire in, so that you have a sensible starting point to this entire continuum that's going to take you from what the camera saw out to what the display can show, okay? And the one other thing that I will mention along those lines is that if you're dealing with nonfiction, you're dealing with archival, you're doing documentary, as I sometimes do, a lot of the time you're going to get stuff that's like second, third, fourth generation, where did this come from type of thing. Most of the time that material is going to be some kind of flavor of Rec 7 or 9. So in that scenario, this is going to look wrong when I do this, but in that scenario, input color space, Rec 7 or 9, Gamma 2.2 or Gamma 2.4, or even Rec 7 or 9 scene, those would all be sensible places to start. And this is not a general prescription that I would offer as a blanket, but if specifically you're dealing with archival or old material and there's truly no chance of even knowing who originally captured or acquired this image, it's a pretty good bet to lay that that's going to be some flavor of Rec 7 or 9 SDR. And so I would play around with my different Rec 7 or 9 possibilities until I found something that felt like it was giving me a decent starting point, okay? So that's kind of the one cutout I would leave for like sort of feeling your way through it. Other than that, I would push that agenda and really stress like, hey, this is important. This is going to make the images look better, faster, and more consistently. So let's figure it out, you know? Last couple of my questions that I'm going to answer for myself that hopefully are useful to you guys as well. What if my color space isn't supported, right? Like, well, what I have like, you know, like a DJI that shoots in a particular color space, but I don't see it in this drop-down menu here. That's another real problem. And here's the deal, guys. We started this conversation by talking about how color management is not new. Color management has been with us for a long time. While that is true, color management frameworks, such as Resolve Color Management, such as ACES, those kind of are new. They're kind of young. We've only had, I mean, digital color grading is young. We've only had it for a couple decades at this point. So these are evolving frameworks, and when you have a color space that isn't supported, there's no great solution to that, honestly. You can look at finding the published science and the published math for that color space if it's out there, and you can tap someone like me to build you a custom transform. In fact, I've got one that I've got several that I've built for these different applications. It's like, oh, the data's out there. It's just that Resolve or ACES haven't caught up to it yet. That would be your best case scenario, is looking for a sort of like third-party solution that gives you a sound, technically neutral and technically accurate transformation. But those are really, you know, kind of like the other edge cases where it's like, all right, well, if it's unsupported, you kind of got to get creative, and you also have to be patient and willing to let the evolution of color management play out, because we've recognized just how high the value prop is, and we recognize that it's worth navigating those edge cases or coming up with solutions for when those edge cases do arise, okay? And we're just about at the end of our time here, but the last one that I just want to throw back in to emphasize in closing. Well, what if I like to do things by hand? We talked about that, colorist, early on in the session. Like, well, wait, you're taking away all of my sort of creative autonomy by doing this color management thing. I want to be the one to transform that image out to its display state. Put it this way, in closing, whether you shot for yourself or you are working for a cinematographer or a production team, you owe them more than that. You owe them a sensible reproduction at a bare minimum of their exposures. And if you don't give them that sensible, neutral reproduction of their exposures, the best you can hope for is that you are most of the time going to compensate fairly well for the error that you yourself have introduced. So that's not really your role to play. Your role to play is to get creative within a sensible framework. And that's a pretty good place to end my spiel about color management and why I think it's awesome. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cullen.
Yeah, buddy.
Incredible wealth of information. I know there are questions out there right now. Great. Okay, so before we get into our Q&A section, we're going to kick off our first giveaway of the day for the Godox ML30 Lite. So if you are watching via live stream, please type !giveaway1 to be entered into that giveaway. And if you haven't deposited your raffle tickets into the appropriate jar, get depositing, y'all. I said that on the internet today. And while people are doing that, does anyone have a question for Cullen? All right, we'll start over here. Go for it, man.
Cullen. In input gamma, so you receive a project shot in like B-RAW Gen 4, but you really want to edit Gen 5. You choose Gen 5. Are you actually using Gen 5, or are you just tweaking Gen 4?
Yeah, so this is a great question. The question is about, in the case of working with B-RAW, what are our sort of options for teeing that into the head of our color management pipeline? If we go into our project settings here, B-RAW is like any raw flavor of camera format. It is what's called a Bayard image. It's just stored in a particular pattern that is efficient for capture, but makes no sense to our eyes. So it has to be unpacked. It has to be de-Bayard. So to answer the question, if I de-Bayer, which is what we are doing when we set our camera raw settings over here, and I de-Bayer my Blackmagic RAW to, I'm going to say decode using project instead of camera metadata, and I de-Bayer saying, Gen 5 instead of camera metadata, I am indeed de-Bayering into that space, and that's now the metric that I'm operating in. Now, here's an important thing to emphasize. This is one of the key differences actually between color managing here versus in nodes, like we talked about before. When you color manage here, it doesn't matter what you say here, it will be ignored. Resolve says, I got this, this is B-RAW, I know what to do with it. There's no setting you can flip here that will change the reproduction of the image. It's just going to automatically hook in. So if you do want to do exactly what you just described, which is to say, hey, I'd like to leverage or audition Gen 5 color science versus Gen 4, you will need to color manage in nodes, as we spent the first half of the session looking at today. Make sense?
Yeah. So like when you did the LUT and then you did the CST, you had slightly different results.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but if you go into here in the project and set up the color management there, are you getting the exact same result with the CSTs as long as they're set up identically?
Yeah, so this is a great question.
And then it's just preferential the way you want to work.
Right. That's a great question. When we did our color management in nodes here, let me turn this color management off for a second, and let's just, this is another one that I think talk is cheap. It's much easier to prove out. So here's our original humble little one-shot color management that we spent some time on earlier. Let's grab a still of that, and then let's wipe everything out here, and then let's do our color management like so. I'm gonna go fast, and we're just gonna say custom. In this case, we're gonna say Aerolog C3 as our input, and we are going to hit save on that. And if I wipe between them, it's indeed identical. So it's a great question. Is this equivalent or is this identical? It is identical. It is a matter of preference, and there's a couple of tunes and tweaks we can make within this approach versus the other, but on the surface, it is the same mechanism that's getting us out to.
So basically the order of operations in terms of what they're doing under the hood to do this are exactly the same in terms of working.
Exactly. The bookends are the same. We are still grading at the same point in the pipeline. It's just two different ways of implementing it.
If you are using project settings to do color management, how does that affect graphics or things that you're making in the Fusion page? Because they do show up as clips on the color, and so are they coming through as like Rec 709 and that's what's expected, or do you have to kind of go through and like click on the individual things and set them in a particular way?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when we are color managing in project settings, what effect does that have on assets that may be flowing over from Fusion, or graphic assets for that matter? And yes, you are correct. What we need to do in that scenario is we're probably going to have our A cam and possibly a B cam and a C cam that all need to be properly set up. And then we're also going to have a bucket for our graphics that need to be sensibly input mapped, typically from like a Rec. 7 or 9 Gamma 2.4, if that's what you're getting from your vendor. And there's workflows and ways to do that, like you can really take advantage of and get fluent in your clip filtration features up here. If I'm working on a feature or something like that, I'm going to figure out what criteria can I use to filter out the different piles of media that needs to have its own separate input mapping, so that I can quickly get all those lumped together in one pile and apply one input transform to color space, or like use case A, use case B, use case C, just depending on what that material is.
Yeah, thanks first for a great presentation. I work in a color space with CSTs as well. But the last two settings on CSTs is the OOTFs. Could you elaborate a little bit on what they do, when to use them and when not to use them? Because I think they're off by default, but sometimes I feel like I get a better result, but I'm not really sure what's going on under the hood there.
Yeah, you guys ready to geek out for a minute? Let's talk about some OOTFs.
Oh, yes.
Opto-optical transform, okay? OOTF is another fancy term, for another sort of like confusing one called system gamma. But I'm going to give you the convention. I'm going to give you the rule of thumb for using the OOTF or not using the OOTF. What we are talking about is this business right here and the CST. When should I apply this forward OOTF? Here's the rule of thumb. When you are going from a scene or a working space to a display space, OOTF is on. Any other time, it is off. So you'll note in this template tree that we built earlier, let's turn our system color management off so the image doesn't look insane. When we are going from working space to display space, my OOTF is on. When I'm going from camera space to working space, or from what we could more broadly call one scene space to another, it stays off. So OOTF, again, the other terminology that's more common there is what's called system gamma. That literally means end to end, how does the weight of the image change between input and output? So it really is only a factor when we have a display space in play. So if you're going from camera or scene space into display space, this would virtually always be on. And then in many cases, when you're doing the opposite, if you're trying to convert from Rec. 7 or 9 and get back into a scene space, you'll often want to use your inverse OOTF. I say often instead of saying always, because who the heck knows exactly how that image was originally encoded for display space, but that's the sort of rule of thumb for specifically the forward OOTF. That's for your output transform, really solely. You don't want it on at any other time, and you really always want it on when you're going out to your display.
All right, this question is from our online stream. It says, what causes poor fusion clip colors, i.e. whites or gray, in the color and other pages, and how to fix it when working DWG color managed workflow? Yes,
this is a really good question. So that can be caused for a lot of different reasons, but the first thing to understand, the first couple things to understand, fusion happens before the color page, okay? So if I do stuff in Fusion on this clip, I will see it represented here in the color page. This also means that what I do in Fusion and the context that I do it in will matter in terms of where I'm starting from. It's going to change what my effective starting point is when that fusioned, to turn a noun into a verb, when that fusioned clip moves into the color page, okay? So it's basically a matter of, before you start to do your fusion comp, figuring out, what do I need to be spitting out here? In an ideal case, in a fusion comp, if you're working Resolve Color Managed like we were today, you want to have your fusion comp spit out DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate at the end, and it should never travel through anything smaller than that, okay? That's probably going to change the way a lot of us work in Fusion, but that's the cleanest possible solution, is for it to never be anything other than living in a big, wide dynamic range, high color volume space. And here's the plot twist. along the way, you need to be able to monitor your image, right? You need to be able to see it in a sensible, reproduced state. So that's a scenario where within Fusion, you would add a color space transform or a LUT or something that takes that high dynamic range scene state image and puts it into a display state for the purposes of your viewing, but then you turn it off before you go over into Resolve, so that when you get into Resolve, all you have is a DaVinci wide gamut intermediate shot that is ready to be teed into that pipeline. That makes sense? Lots of different ways that there's more than one way that this thing can trip us up, but in terms of the ideal solution, that would be the ideal way to set things up from the outset.
Any other questions in-house here? Great.
Yeah, this is kind of a two-part question. If you were editing or color managing footage shot from two cameras, like two angles, two different brands, two generations, different color sciences, how would you match them? And is there a way in DaVinci to kind of see side by side of two clips to compare back and forth? Or how would you handle that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So if we're talking about matching two cameras in a color managed workflow, so let's once again flip back over to our color managed situation here. You guys have probably gotten a first-hand glimpse today of how I've gotten so fast at doing this. You end up doing it a lot. So we're looking at did I do that right? Yep. No. That's right, there we go. So if we only have one particular source color space in this particular instance, but if we were just to kind of use our imagination a little bit, again, the first thing that my expectation, my hope is that, in my mind's eye, if I have a decent capture instrument for camera A and for camera B, the camera has been rated in alignment with the light source that's being used. So if it's a 3200 tungsten source, that's how the camera's been rated on both camera A and camera B. I should have images that align, that agree pretty reasonably well before I start doing anything. And then within there, just to account for the perceptual mismatch or for the error of the camera or the error of the light or the different ways that that misalignment can be introduced or perceived, I'm gonna keep it really, really simple. Balance. Like that's my go-to tool for those things, is just to balance those pieces out by eye. And that can be as simple as even say that, Cullen's idealistic hypothesis is actually true. That capture device was perfect. The light source being used to illuminate the scene was perfect. And so it's that way on camera A and B. Even with all that said, you've got to compensate for flow and for frame contents. If I'm facing, we can even look at it in our frames here. I could have overlapping frame contents, between here and there. They overlap, but they differ as well, don't they? There's a lot more warm stuff happening here than in here. So I may indeed need to warm this up a little bit in order to sell this cut from there to there. It's all about creating flow. And again, that's my goal with color management, is to know that I've got the best possible foundation I can get with the most complete information available to me about how the images were captured, so that within there I can work by eye and work really simply and work really broadly to get it across the finish line. Hope that makes sense.
Hello, thank you for doing this. So when looking for information about color management, I usually see stuff about log or raw, but I shoot in S-Cinetone. So I'm just curious, do I treat that like Rec 709, or how does that come into play here with color management?
Oh, I'm really glad this came up. So we're talking about shooting in Cinetone with Sony cameras. First of all, I get why. In my opinion, that's one of the better looking, they don't style it this way, but that's it's clearly styled after the behavior of a film system, and it can look really, really good. I'll put it to you this way. That is aimed at getting you pretty well close to a finished product out of the camera. So yes, if you wanted to manage that, I would indeed, treat it as Rec 709, because that is what it is. It just happens that it's Rec 709 with quite a bit of preferential mojo cooked into it. So the better option really in the long run would be to start shooting in some sort of log format if you have that available on your camera. If not, then, I love color management. I I pretty much always would work in it. There's very few instances where I wouldn't. But if you're only shooting Cinetone and you feel like that's the only thing available to you, or it's getting you a better result than you're able to replicate by doing color management and a look and all the stuff that I'm showing you here, you might indeed be better off just by like taking that Cinetone, shooting it as if you're shooting like a reversal film, where it's like, I'm either going to get it right in camera or I'm not going to get it right, and letting that ride and making little trims and tweaks right within your Rec 7 or 9 space. That might be indeed a sensible sort of cutout or allowance for saying, I'm not going to color manage because my best results come from capturing in this look, and I don't need to tweak it much, and I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Awesome. I don't know about you guys, but I'm going to start a petition to get a preferential Mojo shirt made for next year's ResolveCon. And of course, all the proceeds will go to Professor Cullen. So, guys, give him a hand. This is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, guys.